Today, we are gathered to dispel a fallacy that has permeated throughout American society, one that has continuously transcended our ability to distinguish historical injustice and moral repugnance with true American values. That fallacy is the purpose of remembrance as a moral principle. The reason why we construct statues and monuments is not simply to document our history. When members of a community create memorials, they are making a statement about the ideas, values, or individuals they think society should remember and honor. It is that statement that leads side affirmation to remove all memorials to the Confederacy. For too long, governing powers have stood by as these symbols of hatred and racism have become shining beacons for the most abhorrent members of society. Today, we confront an issue overlooked by history. To begin today's debate, we have some framing mechanisms. Firstly, this House shall define a memorial as something, especially a structure, established to remind people of a person or event. For the purposes of today's debates, a memorial to the Confederacy shall include any statues, monuments, buildings, parks, or streets that are hereby dedicated to individuals or groups affiliated with the Confederate States of America, and thus their values. Secondly, side affirmation draws a distinction between memorials dedicated to the Civil War and memorials dedicated to the Confederacy. We have no intention of erasing American history, but we'll get to that argument in a second. Thirdly, this House further understands that our jurisdiction on removing Confederate memorials will not extend to structures under private ownership. Therefore, we are only discussing monuments on public land. Fourthly and finally, while side affirmation fully supports the removal of statues and independent structures that otherwise serve no pragmatic purpose to the public, we understand it is unrealistic to demolish parks, streets, and buildings that are dedicated as memorials. Therefore, in those situations, we move to define removal of these memorials as a process of rededication. For example, if a street is named after Robert E. Lee, we won't demolish the street. We will simply rename it. Now, onto arguments of substantive manner. Contention 1 is confronting history. We would like to begin today's debate by addressing a lie that has found itself repeated in virtually every defense of Confederate memorials. That lie goes as follows. Defending Confederate memorials is preserving American history. Here's why this has no application on modern society. Firstly, Confederate history is not American history. Upon secession, the Confederate States of America made it very clear that their intention was to completely separate themselves from the Union. This means they wanted no affiliation to their laws, practices, or culture. Upon doing so, they waived their right to be addressed as part of the history of the United States. It is only because the North won the war that the Union was preserved and Southern states continue to be addressed as part of the United States. Thus, we have the ability to choose what people and events we would like to carry forward with us as a society. And considering that the Confederacy specifically raised its concerns over states' rights on the enslavement of millions of people, it's not surprising that the values of the Southern states are what are being directly contested today. Secondly, this has been done before in other countries. Look to Germany, which was in a very similar situation. In 1949, the new West German government legally codified the banning of Nazi symbols and language, as well as any propaganda. It wasn't until the generation that came in the age of the 1960s that a full reckoning of the war and culture of the Holocaust education began to take hold. Students rose up against the suppression of memory, demanding answers to what their parents had done 25 years earlier. We would articulate that this debate is evidence enough of a new wave of education on what the Civil War actually meant. The next step is exactly what happened in Germany in 2009, when a law was strengthened again under the German Constitutional Court, officially ruling that a march to celebrate a Nazi, Rudolf Hess, was illegal under Article 130 of the Penal Code, which bans anything that approves of, glorifies, or justifies the violent and despotic rule of the Nazi socialists. That is what we are debating on today. We are banning memorials that approve of, glorify, justify the racist, violent actions of an entire region 150 years ago. Contention 2 is origination. It's important for us to all recognize that not all Confederate monuments were established during or immediately after the Civil War. In fact, the vast majority of them were put up far afterwards, specifically with large spikes during times of racial conflict. For example, we saw our first spike of 6 monuments in one year under the formation of the Ku Klux Klan in 1865. Moving forward through time, there are only 2 periods in which we see exponential growth and the establishment of Confederate memorials throughout the United States. Firstly, during the early 1900s, when ex-Confederate states in the South enacted Jim Crow laws, we saw more Confederate statues put in place than at any other time in American history. This even extended in the 1920s with the reemergence of the KKK. The second wave was during the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, with a spike specifically in 1965, the 100th year anniversary of the Civil War. During this time, it even became more common for schools to be named after Confederate leaders and generals. The establishment of these memorials had absolutely nothing to do with remembrance, but intimidation of the most oppressed group in American history at critical times in which their rights were being directly contested. Removal of Confederate monuments takes a step in the right direction by showcasing the United States' understanding of the psychology behind such monuments, erected to showcase white supremacy and rule, not remembrance and moralization. Contention 3. Modern use and understanding. Side affirmation will concede that the secession of the Confederacy had little to do with the moral dilemma of slavery, but instead with states' rights in general. The Southern states wanted to assert their authority over the federal government so that they could abolish federal laws they didn't support. This included the Southern states' rights to keep slaves and take them wherever they wished. Add to this some concerns on territorial expansion and economic growth, and we've painted a picture of a time in which the Civil War began on a basis of political power, not objective morality. We would expect nothing less of the negation than to use this argument to justify the meaning behind these monuments from a historical perspective. However, this House would not only make arguments based on historical meaning of the Confederate monuments, but also argue that it is more important to look at their modern use cases in the present. For example, look back to 2017 when white supremacists and neo-Nazis descended on Charlottesville. Organizers of the Unite the Right rally said they were defending a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The street violence and outpouring of racist and anti-Semitic venom on August 11th and 12th led to 1 death and 28 injuries. But that's not the only example. Look to 2015 as well in Charleston, South Carolina, when 9 African Americans were killed during a Bible study at one of the oldest black churches in the United States. The shooter's website showcased a manifesto of racial hatred and images of a Confederate battle flag. Time and time again, we have witnessed a correlation between lives lost and the memorialization of the Confederacy. And now is when we have to put an end to that. What have we told you today? We've told you that removing Confederate monuments is not erasing history, it is confronting it, just as other countries in similar situations have done before. We've also told you that the origin of the Confederate statues has less to do with the remembrance than it does with intimidation and racism. And finally, we've articulated that in modern society, Confederate symbols are directly associated with hate, racism, and murder. It is for these reasons we urge you to side with the affirmation today. Thank you.